Hello everyone, it is Scott from Heroic Series Gaming making a video for you today. My hair's a little out of control. But today I'm talking about this game, Wrath and Glory, Warhammer 40k tabletop RPG game. I have talked about the tabletop RPG games for Warhammer 40k before, but that was like a big massacre. But I decided to do like a focused one on Wrath and Glory today for the month of January 2023. So that's what we're going to be talking about. I have this camera today because my other camera somewhere else, so that's what we're going to be working with. But Wrath and Glory is the newest in the line of games, Warhammer 40k RPG games. It is made by Cubicle 7. Well, this version is made by Cubicle 7. It originally wasn't. It was originally made by Ulysses Spiel under that sort of licensing agreement with Games Workshop. But the way that book came out was a little bit clunky for people. It was a little bit hard to follow. Wasn't the best quality thing, so they ended up redistributing it, at least in North America, with Cubicle 7. And I think that's how it went for like the whole world, because it seems like the Ulysses Spiel version isn't really available now. But anyway, Wrath and Glory is the newest version, and it's clear that when they made it, they were trying to make an attempt to follow the Warhammer 40k tabletop game, the miniature game, a little bit closer than the other games did. So the other Warhammer 40k RPGs were D100, whereas Wrath and Glory is a D6 system. It's very similar to like the Shadowrun system, if you're familiar with that, or if you're not, then like the Year Zero engine, or etc. Whatever your take on like rolling a big big handful of D6s to accomplish your task, because it's going to be stat plus skills, the number of dice that you roll, and you're going to need to get a certain number on that die to succeed. In this case, ones through threes don't matter on your D6 roll unless it's a Wrath die, but I'll cover that in a second. But basically, you don't get any successes for a 1 or 2 or a 3. And then 4s and 5s are considered successes. They give you a point of success, which is called an icon. And then a 6 is called an exalted icon. It counts as 2 successes, and so that gets you towards your goal, but it can also be shifted if it's unnecessary. Like if you don't need it, like if you only needed 4 successes and you got 7, for example, and one of those came from an exalted die or exalted icon, which is a 6 on the die, you can shift that if you don't need it. If shifting would make you fail, then you can't shift it. But if it would still make you succeed even upon like removing those 2 successes, then you can shift it. And shifting is like gaining more information about a subject, improving the quality of the action that you did, improving your speed, etc. Or it can be banked into a pool called glory points, which the whole group can use to like do better on dice rolls or to succeed on some things. Like it's that kind of thing. Or, heal shock, that kind of stuff. So it's a pool of stuff that everyone can use. So that's what you can do with these extra like 6s that you roll. But when you make the die pool, it's going to be a number of dice. Like let's say you have 4 in the stat and 3 in the skill. You're going to be rolling 7 dice, right? One of the dice has to be indicated as the Wrath die, and they tell you that you should have a die of a different color. Their sets are like black dice with a red die. So the red die is the Wrath die, and you'll always roll 1 special wild die, if you're familiar with that kind of thing, in your dice roll. The die is essentially the same. 2 and 3s don't matter. 4, 5, and 6 do, but the Wrath die has the 1. Essentially, if you get a 1 on a Wrath die, it creates a complication for your action. It's not necessarily negative. It just is a complication. It's some sort of obstacle or twist that comes up. Versus a 6 on the Wrath die, it not only counts as 2 icons, right, the exalted icon thing, but it also gives you 1 automatic glory point to your group's pool. You can only have 6, I think, in the pool, so hopefully that does. But it also counts if it's like combat. It's considered a critical success, right? And that's where you'd go to your critical success table and you see if it's a critical success. So, supposing you succeed, right? If you still failed but you got that exalted icon, you still get the glory point, but it doesn't matter, right? You didn't succeed in attacking the person or whatever, so it doesn't count. But if you succeeded in the attack and you rolled a 6 on the Wrath die, then it counts as this cool critical success, and you also gain the glory point. You gain the glory point either way. But you can also shift it if like it was any other thing. So in combat, you can't shift that Wrath die because you get the critical success. That's sort of the difference. But if it was any other skill challenge, you can shift that critical that critical die roll essentially, and get that shifting option. So it's kind of cool. But you also have in play, so you have the glory points. Like I said, they can be used as a commutable to increase the damage that you do, increase the severity of a critical hit, or this thing called seizing the initiative, which is really useful in combat, and I'll cover that a little bit in a minute. But the other set of things that you have, also because it's Warhammer 40k, because you have like chaos and corruption, you can use the game master can optionally use those wrath dice as corruption points. So every time that a character gains that additional glory point, they also gain a point of corruption. So you can use that to sort of warp corrupt people, which is a cool optional rule. But you also have this thing called the wrath points the players have access to, which is something they can use. They have like 2 of them to start off, but they can also be awarded for doing something cool or narratively awesome. And those can be used to restore shock, or they can be used to add a narrative effect. They can be used to re-roll failures. So there's these like various ways for player agency in the game. So let's talk about the game. So we know what success looks like. We know that if a challenge is going to come up, a person's got to like shoot a person, or they're going to jump off of a building and try to land on another building or whatever, that there's a difficulty essentially, and it's the number of successes that they need to do that thing. That's relatively easy to track. Like a game master could throw like you need 12 successes depending on the dice pool, depending on the thing that they're doing. But on average, 3 is considered like the average difficulty for stuff. So 3 or 4 would be those things that are moderately difficult, but then like it might get more difficult for other things later on. And they base that off the defense of targets for combat. So that's why they sort of set that. And 3 is like the average defense for a character. So when you go to shoot somebody or punch somebody, like on average, their defense is going to be 3. So you're going to need like 3 successes or more to sort of hit them, which is really easy to keep the game moving. Then everyone kind of knows what's happening at the table. And so they know, okay, I got 4 successes. I probably hit that guy. If they got 7 successes, like I definitely hit that person, right? So that's kind of the way that they base that difficulty for like the skill challenges as well. They just kind of worked out how the math would work for people's defenses, and then we're like, all right, so that should be our average number, and then we'll base everything off of that. So that was pretty simple. So we know how that works. But the way that the game is structured is that it's structured in tiers. There's basically 4 tiers of play. This is sort of important because that determines like the difficulty. Like a tier 1, for example, is going to be like street gangers and punks and stuff. Like if you're doing like a Necromunda thing where it's like you're a bunch of street gangers on the ground working for these houses on this planet, then it's a tier 1 game. That's where like the where you can play the Imperial Guard and they're fighting a bunch of just random people, or they're dealing with some kind of heresy or something. You could do that as a tier 1. And then tier 4 is like the elite Space Marines, like the Primaris Space Marines, kicking warp monsters back into the warp and destroying them, right? That's where tier 4 comes in. And so you have that sort of in between. So you've got your grunts and you've got your super extreme elite people. So then most games are going to be probably tier 2 or 3, depending on the like level of difficulty the game master wants to throw out there. How deep do they want this like conspiracy to be? And it sort of affects things like your sort of street cred and the like, right? Based on your tier, there's like more wealth or stuff. There's more influence that you have, so you do more things. So if it's a tier 1 game, you're probably not going to be convincing anyone to do anything based on your influence, right? You're just some random grunt. But if you're a tier 4 Space Marine, right, you can basically be like, I'm a Space Marine, and people go, yes, you are, right? And that's how that will play out. So with those tiers, though, it does create an interesting way for creating characters, and it creates an interesting way for ranking up in the middle of that. So when you go to make your characters, you have to first start off by talking with your other players and your game master and creating a framework for what type of game you're playing. Because if you're all going to be Space Marines, then we're obviously playing a tier 4 Space Marine game. If everyone is going to be Imperial Guard, then we're obviously playing a tier 1 or tier 2 level game, right? So this is the first thing you got to set out is the framework. Like what kind of game are we playing? And then you can work from the tiers from there. So by determining the tier, it determines how many XP you get to build your character. So tier 1 characters will have 100, tier 4 characters will have 400. but it's not like a free form, just go, here's your 400 XP, go build your character kind of thing. There's actually two methods. You can do that. That is one way to do it, but that is much harder and more difficult. You got to do all this math, and you got to figure out, okay, well, 3 points in a stat is this many points versus this many XP versus, like 1 point in a skill, which is this many XP. You got to do all this math. The easier way is to just follow the archetypes that they have. And the archetypes are things like rogue traders, inquisitors, sisters of battle, imperial guard, right? Those kinds of things. So you choose a tier, essentially, and the tier will, and it'll be, there's even Eldari and orc things, like, orc boys, for example, will be in there as an archetype. And in that archetype, there'll be an XP cost. And that's just the cost of just that archetype, which gives you some base stuff to work with. It gives you some base sort of abilities and keynotes. And so it's like, okay, it's going to be 40 XP to be a rogue trader or something, right? And you're like, okay, cool. And then from there you can go, okay, well, then I'm going to go buy all my skills and stats, the normal math method. Or you can continue looking at the archetype, and in the archetype, they've like, here's what the good stats would be for this character. If you were basically making this character, this is what we recommend for the stats, and this is what we recommend for the skills. And then we have suggested talents, choose from these for the talents your character has. So when you go to build that, you could either follow that and try to do it yourself, or you can just look when they did that for everyone, when it's on the archetype, it tells you what the total cost of XP would be to have that stat block, essentially, or that skill block. And so you just kind of go, okay, well, that's the XP for that, so I'll just pay that XP, and I'll pay the XP for the skills, and your character is practically made. The only thing you have left now is to choose the talents, which are like the special abilities for the character. And if you were to crunch the math, which I did when I made a bunch of pre-made characters for a game that we ran, when you do all the math, you do the archetype, the suggested stats as is, just wholesale, and the skills wholesale, it comes out to about 40 or 50 leftover XP, which is about enough to buy 2 or 3, depending on the talents you get, 2 talents, right? The talents range between like 10 to 30 XP points. So with like 50 left over, you can get like a 30 and a 20, and then just have like 10 extra XP that you just kind of lose, right? You can't do anything with that. Maybe bump a skill up by 1, and that's about like a skill from 0 to 1. That's about all you can do with like 10 XP points. So like that's what you would do. So if you just bought it wholesale, the archetype wholesale, and you did that, then the math would come out to being that you get to have 2 talents, and you're pretty well good to go. And then you just have to figure out what war gear you have. And if you do the archetype method, it tells you what war gear you would have. So you might as well just you just do that. Just grab the war gear, because it'll say you get these things, or it'll say you get these things, and you have a choice, this or that, right? It's much like the D&D creation method, where it's like you could have a bow and some arrows, or 2 knives, right? It's very much like that. So you can just grab the gear for the character and just run. So it's really simple to make the character that way. It's a lot harder to try to build your character from scratch. So I know people do that. And I probably would someday to try to create my own character, but for the most part, character creation is pretty quick. You're just like, okay, I'll just accept wholesale this archetype for basically 50 less than what the tier is for it. So certain archetypes are restricted to certain tiers. Like Space Marine is tier 4. So if you're playing a tier 2 game, you can't be a Space Marine. You just can't. But based on that, right, you could take that tier or below. It's up to you how you want to do it. So if it's a tier 2 game, you could be a tier 1 or tier 2 character. So you can take those archetypes as is, and then you'd have leftover XP. So if you're a tier 2 game, then you're going to get 200 XP, but if you take a tier 1 archetype, you're going to have an extra 150 leftover XP, right? Because it's small. It's built for 100 XP. Which means you can do more things with it, but likely you'll do this thing where you ascend, which is part of the character development. I won't really get into that part because that part's a little complicated, but essentially when you ascend, you jump up a tier, and so then you get to do these things. You get to reallocate some points and stuff, and you basically become a higher version of that character, which is something you do in the game. When you play the game, you get XP, and you can use that to buy more skills or upgrade your skills and stats and things like that, and then buy more talents, however you want to spend your XP. It's your XP. And then you would ascend when you reach 100 more, when you basically reach the next tier in XP. XP is handed out relatively small, so that will take a little while, but you can ascend at some point. And when you do that, then you would do the same thing. So if you start off with a tier 1 Imperial Guard, but everyone else is playing tier 2, then you have the XP to just ascend, and so you can ascend and then do that, and then your character's ready to go for that tier 2 game as a tier 2 Imperial Guard rather than tier 1 Imperial Guard. So That's how that would work. But inside the individual tiers, you have these things called ranks. As you gain XP at certain checkpoints during the XP development, which I think is like every 20, I think, you essentially rank up to the next rank. So you start at rank 1 of the tier, so tier 2, rank 1, right? And the ranks, they kind of seem like they don't matter until you realize that a lot of the talents will give you a plus rank to your thing. So you'll have like this one that helps you talk better. You'll get a plus rank to your, talking skills, like that kind of thing. So that matters for your thing, but it also matters in like your influence and some of your wealth and things. But it's also how to track when it's time to level up. So you could have tier. There's only 4 ranks in each tier, right? They did the 4 thing again, so they're obviously labeled to rank 1 through rank 4, and then you ascend, right? And then you start back. You go tier 3, rank 1, right? And that's how you would be when you ascend. So if you were to send a character creation, then you would basically be at the tier with everyone else. You'd be exactly the same as everyone else who started with their character at tier 2. So there's no problem. It all works out smoothly in that end. So, combat. Combat is a main thing in Warhammer 40k. There's talking skills, and they do work great. They work the way that they should. The social stuff works the way that it should. There's some mental resilience. There's this thing called shock, where you can, basically do stuff with the mental side, and it comes in combat as well, so I'll talk about that. But essentially, combat is core and key to the Warhammer 40k universe because the universe is war, right? So combat breaks out. It gets a little loosey-goosey on like when that happens. It's not resolved in the normal way you would think. There's no rolling initiative. Initiative is actually just a stat you have, and it's used for some of your skills and some of your abilities. It's used for determining your defense and stuff, but it is not a number that you use to determine who goes first in combat. In fact, the way that it works is that when a combat breaks out, it will essentially go like this. The game master will decide if the players are surprised, right? Maybe they were ambushed or something. If they're not ambushed, if they're not surprised, then the players will go first. The players will choose amongst themselves who is going to be the first person to take an action, and that person will be the person who takes the action at the beginning of the combat. They'll be doing the first things. They'll be shooting at somebody. They'll be running. They'll be punching. They'll be doing whatever the case is, but they would have their turn. When their turn is over, they can spend a glory point to seize the initiative, meaning that their team's still going to be first, and another person on their team will then take their turn, and they'll do a bunch of stuff. And then when that person ends, if they don't spend a glory point to seize the initiative to let another person on the team go, it goes over to the bad guy side, the GM side. So typically it would be player 1 would essentially act, and then it goes to bad guy 1 for the GM. And then after bad guy 1 has their turn, it goes to player 2, and then they have their turn, and then bad guy 2. And it goes down the line like that. So it jumps back and forth. It goes player 1 to bad guy 1, player 2 to bad guy 2, player 3 to bad guy 3, etc. Jumping back and forth, unless people spend those glory points to seize the initiative, which essentially interrupts that jumping method, and it allows them to continue taking action. So the players can, if they have a bunch of glory points, basically be like, oh, we're in combat, all of us are going to go first. We're just going to keep seizing the initiative for the next player so that we can all keep doing stuff. And you're not restricted on your turn to just like 2 actions. You typically can move and then do some action, unless that action that you're doing is a whole turn action, in which case you can't move, you just do that thing, and that might be healing somebody or something else, right? And then when you're done with your turn, you can do like you got your movement, and then you do your like attack, say. You can then attack again. It's called multi-action, where you do another action on top of that, which just increases the difficulty. So if the defense for shooting a guy is 3, you shoot at him, you can then shoot at him again, but now his defense is 5. And you can shoot at him again, and now his defense is 7. So this multi-attack thing is cool because it really helps for things like when you're fighting off a swarm of orcs or a swarm of anything, really. You can be like, well, I'm not just going to shoot at one guy. I'm going to shoot at like 2 or 3 guys. But swarms are a little different. There's mob rules in there as well, but I'll talk about those in a little bit. But you can essentially keep taking actions as much as you think you have the ability to succeed at them, and then the difficulty just keeps going up until eventually you're like, okay, I can't do anything more. I can't succeed. I'm only rolling 6 dice, and I need 7 successes. I might be able to pull it off if I get a few exalted icons, but probably not, so I'm going to end my turn. Which then makes it very cool for stuff like militaristic type situations where you have like a machine gun. Like you should be able to fire at a couple of different targets with your auto rifle kind of thing instead of just like I get one shot off with my auto rifle and then someone else gets to do a bunch of things. You can do that multiple times, which is very cool. But whenever you attack, you're essentially going to roll your initiative plus your weapon skill or the agility plus ballistic skill, depending on what it is. You're either going to be stabbing somebody or shooting somebody, basically. And the difficulty is the target, the defense of the character, which is essentially their initiative minus 1. That's what your defense is. And so that's why they know, like, the average, defense is going to be 3. Most people's average level of initiative is going to be, like, 3 or 4, so the defenses are going to be, like, 2 or 3. That's how they did that. It's pretty clever. But then you have wounds. You essentially have, when you succeed in attacking somebody, you will essentially apply damage to them, which is essentially their toughness plus 1 is how you determine how many wounds that they have. Well, they have resilience, which is toughness plus 1. Sorry. When you do damage to somebody, they have resilience. It's toughness plus 1 plus armor, and that's what they have. Then they have a number of wounds, which is equal to their toughness, right? So that's just what it is. But so you do the defense, you succeeded in attacking them, and then you did some damage. If the damage is more than their resilience, so if they're wearing Space Marine armor with like extra power stuff, then they might have a ridiculous high resilience, and your gun didn't affect them because it's just too weak. Or you might be firing like a las pistol, which does a decent amount of damage, or a las gun or something. Or you have a chain sword, which does a whole ton of damage. That damage is based on the thing. It'll say this does 10 damage or 20 damage or whatever the weapon does. And so if your damage is more than the resilience, then whatever's left over after the resilience kicks in is wounds. And that's how you damage people. So when they get their wounds down to 0, they are dying, right? However, this works out in an interesting way because it's a war game and you're going to be fighting a lot. You can make a roll. It's called determination whenever you take damage. And, instead of taking wounds, if you succeed in the determination roll, essentially any successes you get on the determination roll turns those wounds into shock. So instead of taking wounds when you potentially would get, like Space Marine hits you with their, chainsword or something, you can make them shock, which is that mental thing that I was talking about before. So it's this mental damage that you take from social challenges or whatever the case is. You can turn those wounds into shock, and so you're just taking this sort of mental damage instead of physical damage. But eventually, when you get to that point where you're at 0, or like when you have no more shock left, right? You've reached your maximum amount of shock of how much it is. You are unconscious. So either way, you're going to drop unconscious. You're either going to be dropped unconscious because you've been wounded a bunch and you're dying, or you're just unconscious. Now, the best part about the shock is that you will go unconscious, which means they can stomp on your face and kill you, but you're not actually dying. But if you take the wounds, you will be dying. If you take any wounds at all, your difficulty goes up by 1 for everything you do, so they balance that out a little bit. So you don't want to be dying. You don't want to take wounds at all. But when you're dying, you essentially take a memorable injury. You fall prone, and you can crawl around or talk. You can cough. You can do basic attack actions, but that's about it. You do some stuff like with your wrath roll. And it just starts increasing the craziness of your dying. You heal a couple of ways. One way is to rest, essentially regroup. It's like a short rest. Some player can make a Medicae roll to heal wounds. For every success on their Medicae roll, they heal that many wounds for you, so you get better. Or you take a respite, which is a long rest. Essentially, you restore all of your wounds in shock, and you're fine. But in order to take those things, regroup or respite, you have to not be dying. So if you don't want to be in that dying situation, which is why you would shove your things into shock. Because if it's just shock, you're fine. You can take a regroup or a respite. But if you're dying, you can't. Someone has to come along and medicate you to make you not dying anymore, and then you can take that regroup or rest type situation. So overall, when we played this out, it actually sounds like really complicated, but when it actually comes down to it, like that resilience thing for damage sounded really complicated, but when we started playing, we realized, oh no, this is actually quite easy. There's like, okay, that guy hit you. He did 10 damage. Your resilience based on your toughness plus armor, or toughness plus 1 plus armor, is 8, so he did 2 damage to you, 2 wounds, right? It's like, oh no, I've got wounds, but then some. Well, let me roll determination, see if I can push that into shock, and like things like that. Turned out to be actually really easy to play out when it came down to it, but it sounds more complicated. When reading the book, it sounds super complicated, but actually it was super easy. So overall, the Wrath and Glory game does a really good job of letting you play in the Warhammer 40k universe and play around with it without being overly complicated. I actually quite enjoyed it. And originally I was like, man, this game, I don't know, reading the rules seems complicated. But when I finally ran it for everybody, it turned out to be super easy and pretty fun. I think ascending is basically the most complex part because it's kind of badly written on what it means to ascend. But other than that, everything else works out perfectly. You've got talents that do things that are cool. Talents that are related to the Emperor and stuff. You've also got, there's supplement books for there's some stuff for the Eldari, but then there's supplements that include more information about the Eldari, more information about Psychers and their special abilities, but there's also psychic power special abilities in there. So everything kind of just plays out really easy. I'm going to use my psychic talent. I'm going to need 5 successes. Bam, did it. All right, I navigate us through the warp. But they have supplements to handle that a little bit better, but overall, the game at its core is super easy, very fun. And I when we played with our players, it was some people who were in my group. There was 2 players who were pretty aware of the Warhammer 40k universe, some more than others, but pretty aware. And then there was my cousin who was 0 knowledge about the Warhammer 40k universe, 0. And he was playing the Space Marine Scout, which is a tier 2 character. So someone who's trying to become a Space Marine but isn't quite there yet. So this was what he was playing, and he started throwing around heresy, the term heresy, a lot in the roleplay, and the other players and all of the NPCs started like really reacting to that, where he's like, this sounds like heresy. And then he kind of began to understand that heresy is not something you throw around, and he started to understand a little bit more of the Warhammer 40k universe, especially when we were talking about the like servitors and the servo skulls and stuff that were around. And he started going, man, this is a crazy cool universe. And I'm like, yes, welcome to Warhammer 40k. And he loved it. The Wrath and Glory rules did a great job of presenting that game to him in a simplistic way that made it very easy. Like, there was a little bit of clunkiness at the very beginning where like 3 of us were trying to figure out exactly what to do. One of the players had played it before, so he was pretty aware. But 3 of us were still working out all the rules. And once we got past a few different skill rolls and stuff, then and like the very first basic combat where my cousin tried to basically attack somebody and he ended up getting knocked unconscious, then it was very smooth. We then had it, and then the rest of the game for the next 3 hours went really, really smooth. Where it was just like, okay, you're doing a thing, okay, make a roll. Okay, you totally did it. Yeah, you jumped. Oh, hey, you got a wrath point. Like, you got a wrath critical. You totally get a glory point, right? You get to do cool things. And so they kept maxing out the glory points and then spending them and then maxing them out again and then spending them. They kept seizing the initiative. It was very good. It was very well done, back and forth gameplay. The only thing I didn't use like the corruption points or whatever it was for me, the dark side stuff to the glory points. I didn't use those very much because I was still trying to learn the game, but I know that they would be easy enough to start adding in for the next time because I understand how the system works now, and I can easily be like, all right, nope, I'm going to do this to make it slightly more complicated for you. So yeah, that worked out beautifully. So overall, I give the game 2 thumbs, and I recommend if you're a fan of Warhammer 40k and you play RPGs to try it out. It's very cool, very simple system. Like I said, it looks more daunting than it actually is, but when you actually start doing it, it's like, oh, this is actually quite simple, very easy, very fun to play. And that's my review. That's my review of Wrath and Glory. That's all I have for you guys. So I hope that you enjoy your Warhammer 40k tabletop RPG gaming experiences, and let me know if you've had some really cool fun times with Wrath and Glory. That's it now. Goodbye, everyone.